1841, beneath the manicured gardens of one of Richmond's most prestigious estates, a secret so monstrous was buried that it would take 180 years to surface. Lady Catherine Montrose, known throughout Virginia society as the Richmond Marquise, vanished from all social records that autumn, along with her 3 young children and enslaved man identified only as Reverend Samuel in plantation ledgers. The mansion's staff was dismissed overnight, the property sealed, and the family name scrubbed from Richmond's elite circles with suspicious haste. For generations, local descendants whispered about cursed ground and restless spirits haunting the old Montrose estate. Neighbors reported strange lights in the abandoned gardens, and no vegetation would grow in certain sections of the property for over a century. Official records claimed Lady Catherine had fled to Europe after her husband's death, taking her children with her. But the enslaved community told a different story, one of midnight rituals, forbidden ceremonies, and a desperate woman's descent into madness fueled by grief and twisted religious fervor. In 2019, when developers began excavating the property for a luxury apartment complex, construction workers made a discovery that would shatter Virginia's carefully curated historical narrative. Beneath an ornate stone fountain, they found a sealed chamber containing remains that DNA testing would later link to the missing Montrose children. But the circumstances of their deaths defied all rational explanation. The presence of ritual objects, encrypted journals, and evidence of systematic spiritual practices involving both the mistress and enslaved people on the plantation revealed a conspiracy of silence that had protected one of Virginia's darkest secrets for nearly 2 centuries. What emerged was not just a story of individual tragedy, but a window into the twisted power dynamics of antebellum slavery, where desperation, religious mania, and absolute authority created conditions for unthinkable acts. The Reverend Samuel, investigators discovered, was no ordinary enslaved person. He was a spiritual leader who had preserved West African religious traditions and whose relationship with Lady Catherine had crossed every boundary of power, race, and morality that defined the plantation system. Their alliance would produce consequences that still echo through Virginia's landscape today. This is the story of how Richmond's elite conspired to bury not just bodies, but truth itself, and how the ground itself refused to keep their secrets forever. Chapter 1. The Autumn of Silence. 184 years ago in October 1841, the most powerful families in Richmond, Virginia gathered at the Montrose estate for what would become the city's most infamous social event, though not for the reasons originally intended. Lady Catherine Montrose, widow of shipping magnate Edmund Montrose, had promised an announcement that would reshape our understanding of Providence itself. But when guests arrived at the mansion's iron gates that evening, they found the property dark, the doors barred, and Lady Catherine nowhere to be found. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Within days, rumors consumed Richmond's elite circles. The Montrose children, Elizabeth, aged 9, James, aged 7, and infant Catherine, had vanished along with their mother. More disturbing was the disappearance of an enslaved man, known throughout the plantation as Reverend Samuel, a spiritual leader who had somehow maintained extraordinary influence despite his bondage. Plantation records from neighboring estates noted his absence with unusual attention, suggesting his importance extended beyond the Montrose property. The official explanation arrived swiftly, delivered by Lady Catherine's brother-in-law, Judge Harrison Montrose. His statement to Richmond's newspapers was brief and decisive. Devastated by grief following her husband's death at sea 6 months earlier, Lady Catherine had suffered a complete mental collapse and fled to her family's estate in England, taking her children for an extended recuperation. The enslaved Reverend Samuel had simply been sold south, a common enough occurrence to raise no suspicion. But enslaved people working in Richmond's finest homes told a different story in whispered conversations. They spoke of screams heard from the Montrose gardens in the weeks before the disappearance, of Lady Catherine wandering the grounds at midnight in blood-stained nightclothes, of the Reverend Samuel conducting ceremonies by candlelight in the estate's old chapel. Most disturbing were accounts of children's voices calling out during these midnight gatherings, not in fear, witnesses claimed, but in something resembling religious ecstasy. Within a month, the Montrose estate was sealed and placed under Judge Harrison's control. The entire enslaved population, 47 people, was sold at auction with suspicious speed, scattered across plantations from North Carolina to Louisiana. The mansion's staff of free servants disappeared into Richmond's working class, their silence apparently purchased or coerced. When questioned years later by historians, survivors refused to speak of their time at the estate, their eyes holding a terror that transcended normal memory. The property itself seemed to rebel against what had occurred within its boundaries. Gardeners hired to maintain the grounds reported that certain sections of the elaborate garden refused to sustain life. Where once roses and magnolias had bloomed in carefully cultivated beds, only bare earth remained. The ornate stone fountain at the garden center, imported from Italy at enormous expense, dried up despite the water channels remaining intact. Workers refused to enter the chapel after dark, and several quit after claiming they heard children singing hymns in languages they didn't recognize. Richmond's elite moved quickly to erase the Montrose name from their social circles. Portraits were removed from the city's finest homes. Business partnerships were dissolved. Even the family's pew at St. John's Church was reassigned. The speed and thoroughness of this erasure suggested coordination at the highest levels of Virginia society. A collective decision to bury whatever had happened at the estate beneath layers of silence and social amnesia. Yet in the enslaved quarters across Richmond and beyond, memory persisted. Oral histories passed down through generations spoke of the Marquise's pact and the Reverend's sacrifice. These accounts described Lady Catherine as a woman driven mad by grief, who had turned to West African spiritual practices, seeking to resurrect her dead husband through rituals that required unthinkable offerings. The Reverend Samuel, according to these suppressed histories, was no mere participant but a central figure, a man who had preserved sacred knowledge across the Middle Passage and who wielded spiritual authority that transcended the physical chains of slavery. Documents that survived the deliberate purge of Montrose family records reveal troubling details. Lady Catherine's personal correspondence from the months before her disappearance shows an obsession with death, resurrection, and the restoration of what was stolen. She wrote repeatedly about breaking the barriers between worlds and offerings that can compel divine intervention. Most disturbing were references to her children as vessels of redemption and to Reverend Samuel as her guide through darkness. Plantation ledgers from neighboring estates noted unusual purchases made by Montrose household staff in the weeks before the disappearance. Large quantities of candles, specific herbs with no culinary purpose, and metals typically used in ritual objects rather than household goods. One entry, dated September 15, 1841, recorded the arrival at the Montrose estate of 3 sealed crates from Port-au-Prince, suggesting connections to Haitian voodoo practices that had terrified white slaveholders since the Haitian Revolution. The last confirmed sighting of Lady Catherine alive came from a free black washerwoman who delivered linens to the estate on October 12, 1841. She later testified to a church elder that she had seen the lady standing in the garden at dusk, her children arranged in a circle around her, while Reverend Samuel stood at the center holding what appeared to be a ceremonial blade. The children, the witness claimed, were singing in perfect unison, a sound that still haunted her dreams decades later. Chapter 2. The Reverend's Power. To understand what transpired at the Montrose estate in 1841, we must first understand the extraordinary figure of Reverend Samuel, a man whose very existence challenged every assumption about power, knowledge, and resistance within the slavery system. Unlike most enslaved people whose lives were documented only through their labor value and physical descriptions, Reverend Samuel left traces across multiple plantation records, court documents, and private correspondence that paint a portrait of someone who defied easy categorization. Born around 1790 in what is now Benin, Samuel had been captured at approximately 30 years old, an unusually advanced age for the transatlantic slave trade, suggesting his seizure may have been specifically targeted rather than the random violence that characterized most enslavements. Ship manifests from the slave ship Providence, which arrived in Charleston in 1820, listed him as Samuel, priest, literate in unknown script, speaks French and tribal languages. This notation alone was extraordinary. Most enslaved people were recorded only by estimated age, gender, and physical condition. Samuel's first owner, a rice planter named Jonathan Whitfield, noted in his personal diary that the man was unlike any African I have encountered, possessing education that rivals our own ministers, and carrying himself with dignity that no amount of correction can diminish. Whitfield, a devout Presbyterian, had purchased Samuel specifically hoping to convert him into a Christian preacher who could minister to the plantation's enslaved population. What Whitfield didn't anticipate was that Samuel would instead syncretize Christian imagery with his own spiritual traditions, creating a religious practice that appeared orthodox on the surface while maintaining deep connections to West African cosmology. By 1825, Samuel had become known throughout the South Carolina Low Country as a powerful spiritual figure. Enslaved people traveled miles on their rare free Sundays to hear him preach. Plantation owners tolerated this because Samuel's sermons seemed to emphasize obedience, patience, and faith in divine justice, messages that served slaveholder interests. But encoded within his biblical references were preservation of African spiritual practices, resistance strategies, and maintenance of cultural memory that the slave system sought to eradicate. Court records from 1830 reveal a turning point in Samuel's life. Following the death of Jonathan Whitfield, his widow sold the plantation and most of its enslaved population. Samuel was purchased by a Virginia slave trader who recognized the man's value extended beyond field labor. For the next 5 years, Samuel was sold and resold across the Upper South, his reputation preceding him. Each plantation owner discovered that his presence somehow reduced unrest, increased productivity, and created a sense of order, though none understood that Samuel was actually building networks of spiritual resistance that connected enslaved communities across state lines. In 1835, Edmund Montrose purchased Samuel for the extraordinary sum of $1,500, 3 times the typical price for a prime field hand. Montrose's letters to business associates explained that he sought a civilized servant who could serve as chaplain to our people and tutor to our children. What drew Edmund to Samuel remains unclear, but their relationship evolved beyond typical master-slave dynamics. Plantation records show Samuel lived not in the slave quarters but in a small house behind the main chapel, held authority to discipline other enslaved people, and had access to the estate's library, privileges that suggested Edmund saw him as something other than property. Lady Catherine's diary entries from this period, discovered in 2022 in a Richmond archive, provide disturbing insights into her fascination with Samuel. She wrote of his eyes that seemed to perceive dimensions beyond our material world, and his knowledge of forces that our Christian faith barely acknowledges. After Edmund's death at sea in March 1841, Catherine's entries became increasingly frantic. She described midnight conversations with Samuel about resurrection, about spiritual practices that could tear open the veil between life and death, and about sacrifices that might compel divine intervention. What made Samuel agree to whatever occurred in October 1841 remains one of the case's greatest mysteries. Some historians argue he was coerced, that Lady Catherine used threats against other enslaved people to compel his cooperation. Others suggest he saw an opportunity to escape or to exact revenge on the system that had enslaved him. But a third theory, supported by fragments of Samuel's own writings found during the 2019 excavation, suggests something more complex, that he genuinely believed in the spiritual workings he and Catherine were attempting, and that he saw her children as innocent victims of slavery's evil, who might transcend their role in the system through transformation. A letter fragment in Samuel's handwriting, carbon dated to 1841, reads, "The children know not the sins of their fathers. Through water and blood, through earth and spirit, perhaps innocence can be preserved while the corrupt order falls. What we do here will echo. Let those with ears hear what the ground remembers." The relationship between Catherine and Samuel violated every social boundary of antebellum Virginia. a white woman of the highest social class, and an enslaved black man engaged not just in intellectual exchange, but in spiritual collaboration that assumed equal authority. This alone would have been explosive had it become public. Add the elements of West African religious practices, rituals involving her children, and the apparent willingness of both parties to pursue actions that transcended law and morality, and you have a situation that Richmond's elite would go to any length to suppress. Enslaved people who worked at the Montrose estate later testified to church elders that they had witnessed Catherine and Samuel spending hours together in the chapel, surrounded by objects that combined Christian iconography with items they recognized from African spiritual traditions. Candles arranged in specific patterns, herbs burned at particular times, words spoken in languages that weren't English, French, or any tribal dialect they recognized. All suggested a hybrid spiritual practice that drew from multiple traditions while belonging fully to none. Chapter 3. The Children's Voices. The Montrose children, Elizabeth, James, and infant Catherine, were by all accounts unusual even before the events of autumn 1841. Neighbors' correspondence and plantation visitors' journals described children who possessed an eerie composure, a tendency toward intense religious devotion, and what one guest called eyes that seemed ancient in their young faces. Their mother had educated them far beyond typical standards for their age and gender, teaching Elizabeth Latin and Greek, instructing James in astronomy and natural philosophy, and exposing them to religious texts from multiple traditions, an education that scandalized Richmond's traditional families. After Edmund Montrose's death, witnesses reported that the children's behavior became increasingly strange. They stopped playing childish games, instead spending hours in the estate's chapel with their mother and Reverend Samuel. Servants described hearing them recite passages in languages no one recognized, seeing them participate in ceremonies that combined Christian prayer with African rhythms and movements. Most disturbing were accounts of the children claiming to see Father in dreams, describing conversations with their deceased parent in precise detail that went beyond normal childhood imagination. Lady Catherine's diary reveals her conviction that her children possessed special spiritual sensitivity, what she called the sight beyond sight. She wrote extensively about Elizabeth's claims of seeing people who aren't there anymore, about James describing the layers of the world, and about infant Catherine responding to presences that adults couldn't perceive. Rather than dismissing these as childhood fantasy, Catherine and Reverend Samuel apparently cultivated these abilities, viewing the children as potential bridges between the living and the dead. The question that haunts this case is whether the children understood what was happening to them. Psychological analyses conducted on Catherine's diary entries in 2023 suggest she genuinely believed she was protecting her children from what she perceived as the spiritual corruption of slavery-based society. She wrote repeatedly about preserving their innocence, about transformation rather than destruction, and about creating a doorway through which purity could enter a fallen world. These were the words of a woman who had convinced herself that whatever she planned was an act of salvation rather than harm. Reverend Samuel's perspective is harder to discern. His written fragments suggest he saw the children as tragic figures, born into a system built on unspeakable evil, destined to either perpetuate that evil or be destroyed by resisting it. In one passage he wrote, "These small ones carry the weight of centuries they did not create. Perhaps there is another path, not of this world or the next, but between, where innocence need not be sacrificed to either darkness or light." Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Testimonies from enslaved people who worked in the Montrose household provide the most detailed accounts of the children's final weeks. A woman identified only as Aunt Ruth in church records told her pastor in 1875 that young Elizabeth had approached her in late September 1841, speaking words that still echoed decades later. "Mama says we're going to help bring Papa home. Reverend Samuel says we have to be very brave and very pure. We won't be here anymore, but we won't be gone either. We'll be everywhere and nowhere, watching over everyone." James, the 7-year-old, apparently showed more resistance. Multiple witnesses recalled hearing him crying at night, begging his mother to stop the ceremonies, saying he was frightened of the dark that Reverend Samuel shows us. But Elizabeth seemed to embrace whatever was planned, behaving like a child who had been convinced she was participating in something sacred and necessary. The infant, of course, had no voice in whatever destiny had been chosen for her. The night of October 17, 1841, was recorded in multiple sources as unusually still. No wind and oppressive humidity despite the autumn season, and what several witnesses described as an unnatural silence, where even insects seemed to have ceased their sounds. Enslaved people in quarters on neighboring plantations reported seeing lights moving in geometric patterns through the Montrose estate's gardens, hearing children's voices singing in perfect harmony, and experiencing an overwhelming sense of dread that kept them awake despite exhaustion from the day's labor. One account, recorded by a free black minister named Reverend Thomas Jackson in his personal journal, described an encounter with a terrified enslaved man who had escaped the Montrose property that night. The man claimed he had been forced to assist in preparing the garden's stone fountain, creating a sealed chamber beneath it. He described the children being led to this location dressed in white ceremonial clothes, speaking words and languages he didn't understand, showing no fear but rather an expression of rapture that haunted him for the rest of his life. The man disappeared before dawn, likely recaptured and sold away, his testimony dying with him. What happened at the fountain remains subject to interpretation and controversy. Physical evidence discovered in 2019 confirms that the children died that night, but the exact mechanism and circumstances remain disputed. What cannot be disputed is that afterward, Lady Catherine Montrose, Reverend Samuel, and the 3 children vanished from all public record, beginning a cover-up that would last almost 2 centuries. The garden itself seemed to bear witness to what occurred. Within weeks, the elaborate landscaping began dying despite careful maintenance. The fountain's water turned dark and foul-smelling, refusing to circulate even when the mechanisms were completely replaced. Workers reported feeling overwhelming sadness when approaching the area, and several claimed to hear children's voices singing faintly when the wind was still. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Silence. Judge Harrison Montrose moved with remarkable speed to seal the estate and silence all witnesses. Within 48 hours of the children's disappearance, he had obtained emergency custody orders from a sympathetic magistrate, evicted all enslaved people from the property, and posted armed guards at the gates. His official statements to Richmond newspapers emphasized Lady Catherine's mental collapse and his duty to protect both family reputation and business interests during this temporary crisis. But documents discovered in Virginia State Archives in 2021 reveal the judge's actions were part of a coordinated conspiracy involving Richmond's most powerful families. A ledger marked Montrose Discretionary Fund shows payments to newspaper editors, court clerks, ship captains, and clergy. Bribes designed to control information and manufacture a plausible narrative. The amounts were staggering. Over $25,000 in 1841 currency, equivalent to millions today, suggesting the stakes extended far beyond protecting one family's reputation. Why would Virginia's elite invest so heavily in covering up whatever occurred at the Montrose estate? The answer lies in the deeply threatening nature of what Catherine and Reverend Samuel represented, a complete breakdown of the racial and social hierarchies that made the slavery system function. A white woman of the highest class collaborating with an enslaved black man in spiritual practices that challenged Christian authority, potentially resulting in the deaths of white children. This narrative struck at the foundation of every justification slaveholders used for their system. If it became public that a respected Virginia lady had turned to African religious practices and elevated an enslaved man to equal spiritual authority, it would validate every white Southerner's deepest fear that slavery was not a benevolent institution with happy, childlike enslaved people and wise paternal masters, but rather a system of violence that corrupted everyone it touched, making monsters of the enslavers and revolutionaries of the enslaved. The conspiracy to silence the truth manifested in multiple ways. All 47 enslaved people from the Montrose estate were sold at auction on October 25, 1841, just 8 days after the children's disappearance. Bills of sale, preserved in county records, show they were deliberately separated, sold to buyers across 6 different states, ensuring they could never gather to share their knowledge. Several were purchased by notorious slave traders who specialized in the Deep South's most brutal plantations, where life expectancy was measured in years and communication with the outside world was impossible. Free servants who had worked in the Montrose household found themselves unable to secure new employment in Richmond. Letters written by former staff members to relatives, found in family collections decades later, describe being blacklisted by every wealthy household in the city, receiving visits from men who threatened violence if they spoke about their time at the estate, and watching helplessly as their families were driven into poverty by systematic social and economic exclusion. The physical estate itself became a tool of erasure. Judge Harrison hired contractors to seal the chapel where most ceremonies had occurred, filling it with concrete and bricking over the windows. The garden fountain was surrounded by a tall iron fence with locked gates, ostensibly for safety, but effectively preventing anyone from examining the area. Landscaping crews were brought in monthly to remove any vegetation attempting to grow near the fountain, maintaining the appearance that the ground's barrenness was intentional rather than an inexplicable consequence of what lay buried beneath. Richmond's churches played their part in the silence. St. John's Episcopal Church, where the Montrose family had been prominent members, removed all record of Catherine's charitable work and children's baptisms from official registries. The rector, Reverend William Harrison, the judge's cousin, delivered a sermon the Sunday after the disappearance that spoke cryptically about the corrupting influence of foreign practices and the necessity of forgetting certain sins so completely that even memory of them becomes a form of participation. His message was clear. To speak of the Montrose case was itself a form of moral contamination. Legal mechanisms reinforced the silence. Judge Harrison used his authority to seal all court records related to the estate, claiming they contained sensitive commercial information that could harm business interests if made public. When a young journalist named Patrick Brennan attempted to investigate rumors about the Montrose disappearance in 1843, he was arrested on fabricated charges, held in jail for 2 months, and eventually released only after agreeing to leave Virginia permanently. Perhaps most effective was the weaponization of shame and scandal. Richmond's elite spread rumors that Lady Catherine had been engaged in an intimate relationship with Reverend Samuel. Rumors that, whether true or false, rendered the entire topic so socially toxic that respectable people refused to discuss it. By framing the case as sexual transgression rather than whatever actually occurred, the conspiracy transformed truth-seeking into participation in obscenity. The enslaved and free black communities of Richmond understood the message clearly. They had witnessed something that threatened the entire social order, and speaking of it would bring devastating consequences. Oral histories passed down through generations describe the Montrose case as the silence we were forced to keep and the truth that cost too much to speak. Even in private conversations among family members, people spoke in metaphors and indirect references, afraid that explicit discussion might somehow reach the ears of those determined to maintain the cover-up. By 1845, just 4 years after the disappearance, the Montrose case had effectively been erased from Richmond's public memory. The estate remained sealed, slowly deteriorating behind its iron gates. The family name disappeared from social circles, and whatever had occurred in the garden on that October night became a ghost story, dismissed by respectable people as superstition, while haunting the descendants of those who had witnessed it. Chapter 5. The ground remembers. For 178 years, the sealed chamber beneath the Montrose estate's fountain kept its secrets. The property changed hands multiple times, each owner noting strange phenomena but finding no explanation. In 1889, a development company attempted to demolish the mansion and divide the land for row houses, but abandoned the project after workers refused to continue, citing oppressive spiritual presences and unexplained equipment failures. The land reverted to the city, which declared it a public park but never developed it due to its reputation for being cursed. Throughout the 20th century, the former Montrose estate became Richmond's most persistent urban legend. Teenagers dared each other to climb the fence at night, reporting experiences that followed disturbing patterns: overwhelming sadness near the fountain, voices singing in unknown languages, and the sensation of small hands touching their faces. Multiple people claimed to see 3 children dressed in white standing near the sealed chapel, always just at the edge of vision, disappearing when directly observed. Local historians occasionally attempted to investigate the Montrose disappearance, but they encountered systematic obstacles. Records that should have existed were missing from archives. Descendants of people who had lived through the events refused interviews or claimed ignorance. The few documents that survived were heavily redacted or damaged in ways that seemed suspiciously deliberate. A 1967 master's thesis attempting to reconstruct the case was rejected by the University of Virginia's History Department as unsuitable for academic inquiry. The breakthrough came not from historians, but from developers. In 2018, Richmond's booming real estate market finally overcame the property's dark reputation. A luxury development corporation purchased the land, planning a complex of high-end apartments with ground-floor retail. The city's Historical Preservation Board approved demolition after determining the deteriorated structures held no architectural significance, a decision that would prove catastrophically premature. Excavation began in May 2019. Within 2 weeks, construction workers operating heavy machinery near the old fountain area reported equipment malfunctions that engineers couldn't explain. A backhoe suddenly shut down directly over the fountain site, its operator claiming he heard children's voices through the machine's noise. When workers attempted to remove the ornate stone fountain to salvage for architectural resale, they discovered it was far heavier than it should have been, as if something beneath was pulling it downward. On June 3, 2019, as workers used jackhammers to break up the fountain's base, they breached a sealed chamber that no modern record indicated existed. The foreman, Marquise later testified that the moment the chamber opened, a smell came out that wasn't decay or mold. It was like incense and copper and something else I can't describe. And immediately, every worker on site felt like they were being watched by children. Inside the chamber, police investigators found remains that would revolutionize understanding of the Montrose case. 3 small skeletons were arranged in a circle, their positions suggesting they had been placed there deliberately rather than buried after death. Surrounding them were objects that combined Christian and West African spiritual traditions: crucifixes intertwined with carved wooden figures, rosary beads mixed with shells and stones, candles that had somehow not fully decayed despite nearly 180 years underground. Most disturbing were the objects held in the children's skeletal hands. Elizabeth's remains clutched a leather-bound journal filled with entries in what cryptographers later identified as a cipher used by certain secret societies. James held a small metal box containing human hair, later DNA tested and confirmed to match his father, Edmund Montrose. The infant's remains were wrapped in cloth embroidered with symbols that combined Christian iconography and West African spiritual sigils. But it was the 4th skeleton that transformed the case from tragedy to something far more complex. The remains of an adult male, identified through dental records and bone analysis as consistent with African ancestry from the Benin region, lay at the circle's center. This was Reverend Samuel, and the circumstances of his death defied simple explanation. His position suggested he had been alive when sealed in the chamber, his arms extended toward the children in what forensic anthropologists described as either a protective or sacrificial gesture. Chemical analysis of bone samples revealed that all 4 individuals died from the same cause: acute poisoning from a combination of plant toxins that matched substances referenced in both West African spiritual practices and Lady Catherine's diary. But the timing of their deaths created a mystery that still generates controversy. Bone degradation patterns and toxicology reports suggested they didn't die simultaneously. Samuel's death occurred several hours before the children's, raising terrible questions about whether he witnessed what happened to them and whether his death was suicide, murder, or something stranger. The sealed chamber contained one more crucial piece of evidence: Lady Catherine's final journal entry, written on thick parchment and sealed in a glass container. The entry, dated October 17, 1841, read, "We have completed the preparation. Samuel has assured me the children will not suffer. They understand they are becoming something greater than the world they leave behind. Through their sacrifice, they will transcend the evil that permeates this society built on bondage. I cannot follow where they go, and that is my punishment. but I will ensure no one forgets what was done here, even if it takes centuries for truth to emerge. The garden will remember, the ground will testify, and the children will sing forever. Chapter 6. The Echo That Never Ends. The discovery of the sealed chamber in 2019 forced Richmond to confront a history it had spent nearly 2 centuries suppressing. Initial media coverage focused on the sensational aspects, the skeletal remains, the occult objects, the bizarre circumstances. But as researchers began connecting the physical evidence to suppressed historical records, a more complex and disturbing picture emerged of institutional conspiracy, racial terror, and systematic erasure of truth. DNA analysis conducted on the children's remains created unexpected complications. Modern descendants of the Montrose family, still prominent in Virginia society, were contacted for comparison samples. Several refused, citing privacy concerns, but others cooperated. The results confirmed the children's identities but also revealed something that explained the extraordinary lengths taken to suppress this case. Evidence that not all the children were Edmund Montrose's biological offspring. Advanced genetic testing suggested that at least one child shared paternal DNA markers consistent with West African ancestry, specifically, markers matching Reverend Samuel's profile. This finding, while subject to the limitations of historical DNA analysis, supported what oral histories in Richmond's Black community had whispered for generations, that Lady Catherine's relationship with Samuel extended beyond spiritual collaboration. The implications were explosive. These children represented not just victims of whatever occurred in 1841, but living evidence of the ultimate violation of Virginia's racial caste system. This revelation reframed everything. Lady Catherine's obsession with transformation and transcendence took on new meaning. Perhaps she sought to protect children who would have been destroyed by society's discovery of their mixed heritage. Samuel's willingness to participate made more sense if he was attempting to save his own child from the horrors that awaited mixed-race children in antebellum Virginia. The children's reported claim that they were becoming everywhere and nowhere might have been literal, choosing transformation over certain destruction. But this sympathetic interpretation competed with darker possibilities. Forensic psychologists reviewing Catherine's diaries and the physical evidence suggested she displayed symptoms of severe mental illness exacerbated by grief. Her writings showed increasing paranoia, religious mania, and dissociation from reality. Samuel's motivations remained opaque. Was he a collaborator in delusion, a trapped victim using spiritual authority as resistance, or a true believer in the transformative practices they performed? The legal aftermath of the discovery highlighted how thoroughly the original conspiracy had succeeded. Despite clear evidence of multiple deaths, no criminal charges could be brought against the long-dead Judge Harrison or his co-conspirators. The statute of limitations had expired over a century ago. Descendants of the enslaved people forcibly dispersed in 1841 had no legal standing to sue for the trauma and economic destruction their ancestors endured. The conspiracy's architects had escaped all earthly justice. Richmond's response to the revelation followed predictable patterns. The city's political establishment offered carefully worded statements acknowledging tragic events while avoiding specific responsibility. Historical markers were commissioned but contained language so sanitized that visitors learned almost nothing about what actually occurred. Proposals to create a memorial to the children and to Reverend Samuel sparked controversy, with opponents arguing it would celebrate crimes rather than memorialize victims. The development company abandoned the luxury apartment project, unable to overcome both the property's dark history and the resistance from community groups who argued the site should be preserved. The land entered legal limbo, owned by the city, but with no clear plan for its future. As of 2025, it remains fenced and inaccessible. The chamber where the remains were found sealed again, though this time with proper archaeological documentation rather than conspiracy. But perhaps the most significant impact has been on understanding of slavery's psychological dimensions. The Montrose case revealed how the system's violence extended beyond physical bondage to create conditions where even resistance could become twisted into tragedy. Lady Catherine's turn to African spiritual practices was both a rejection of the Christianity that sanctified slavery and a grotesque appropriation that replicated slavery's power dynamics in spiritual form. Samuel's collaboration demonstrated how enslaved people had to navigate impossible choices where every option carried devastating consequences. Academic historians now teach the Montrose case as an example of how slavery corrupted not just through violence but through the psychic damage inflicted on everyone within the system. The children became victims of both their mother's madness and a society that would have destroyed them had they lived, killed by love, fear, delusion, and the impossibility of transcending slavery's evil while remaining within its boundaries. If this story has gripped you, leave a like. It helps the story of the Montrose children and Reverend Samuel reach more people. Today, reports continue of strange phenomena at the old Montrose estate. Visitors to the fence line report hearing children's voices singing, seeing lights moving through the garden at night, and experiencing overwhelming emotions they can't explain. Skeptics dismiss these as suggestion and urban legend, but those who have experienced the phenomena describe it with disturbing consistency. Children who sound joyful rather than distressed, singing in languages no one recognizes, seeming to call to visitors rather than haunt them. The ground remembers what society tried to forget. The garden that refused to grow for 178 years now blooms sporadically with flowers no one planted. White roses that appear near the sealed chamber each October, regardless of weather or season. Botanists have no explanation. Neither does anyone else. The Montrose case remains Richmond's wound that won't heal, its secret that refuses to stay buried, its echo that never ends. Perhaps that was Lady Catherine's final victory over those who conspired to silence her story. She ensured it would persist in the ground itself, waiting for a time when truth could finally be acknowledged, however incomplete and troubling that truth might be. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten histories. Thank you for following the case of the Richmond Marquise and the children who were sacrificed to transcend a world too evil to endure. See you in the next video.